Hello and welcome to this video, which is going to be about reinforced versus impenetrable. Which one should I pick? In this video we're going to dive into how do we compare reinforced, so armor, to impenetrable, which is critical resistances, and how do I make the choice for which one is better for my build. So one of the first things that is important when comparing these two types of resistances is that they cannot be compared on equal terms. 20% critical resistances are not equal to 20% mitigation from armor. What we need to do is convert to current damage reduction. Current damage reduction is what everything else in ESO is, more or less. So when you get a buff, like a major or a minor buff or a class passive that says it reduces damage, these different types of mitigation are all multiplicative, which means they all reduce current damage. And the thing about multiplication is that it doesn't matter what order you multiply in. So it doesn't matter if armor is applied first or critical resistances are applied first once they are converted to current damage mitigation. So it's very important that we convert to this current damage. It's like in physics when you had some numbers in kilograms and others in tons, and to be able to convert to compare these two numbers, you need to convert them to the same unit, which would usually be kilograms. And tons are a lot of kilograms, and kilograms are not that many tons. And it really does matter because 20% critical resistances are not equal to 20% armor. So how do we convert armor to current damage? And this is actually a pretty simple equation. So what you need to know first is, what is your current armor? This is what really matters, because armor scales on itself. So if you imagine you had 23,760 armor, that would really mean you had 36% damage mitigation from armor already. That means then if I got another 660 armor, which would mean I got 1% more damage mitigation, so now it's 37% damage mitigation. In current damage terms, what we need to do is then subtract the 36% from 1 and divide by the remainder, which is 0.64 or 64%. And that actually means this 1% armor we got moving from 36 to 37% armor is then 1.56% damage mitigation. That means that this 1% from armor actually reduces our current damage by 1.56%. And that is quite a big increase, and that is because armor scales exponentially on itself. Why does it scale on itself? And that is, I found this way to be the best way to explain it. So if you imagine an original hit of 1,000 damage from an enemy, and we were at 0 armor, and we got 20% mitigation, which means that we reduce this damage hit by 200 damage. The damage, the hit we would receive would then be 800. Then we got another 200 damage or 20% damage mitigation from armor. That means that the hit is now hitting for 600 instead. And what we find is then that it's actually a 25% damage reduction. So just getting around 200 means we're now getting 25% damage reduction. We get another 10%, which means we're now at 50% damage mitigation. And we see that the hit is now hitting for 500, but that last 10% was actually 16.6% damage reduction. So what we see is that we have exponential returns because the hit gets relatively smaller. The armor gives the exact same all the time, that's a constant, but the hit gets relatively smaller, and that means that the percentage mitigation from armor rises exponentially. And that is why stacking armor is really, really good. But this also has a catch. The catch is that armor then does worse against builds with high penetration, because then you would start with a higher hit. Or so armor scales exponentially on itself, but it's also then countered more heavily by high penetration builds, but does better against low penetration builds, because then allows the armor to be higher when you apply something like a reinforced trait. We then move on to critical resistances, and just like with armor, critical resistances actually scale on themselves. So we start off with a 60% modifier, and we imagine that we have 20% in critical resistances. That means the hit is now 140 instead of 160. That's a 12.5% mitigation. Then we get another 20, that's 14.28, and then we get the last 20, and that is actually 16.6% mitigation. So just like with armor, critical resistances scale exponentially on themselves. It's the same type of math, but because critical resistances start above 100, you see the numbers are always lower. You saw with armor that 1% was more than 1% mitigation. With critical resistances, it's always going to be lower than the numbers. So 20% critical resistances will at most give you 16.6% damage mitigation, but they do scale exponentially on themselves. But this is why you cannot just compare the numbers when you get them at first. You need to convert them to current damage, because critical resistances apply above 100, they will always be lower than the actual numerical number themselves. So the other thing about the critical resistance is, just like armor was countered by penetration because you then had a lower base armor to apply the trade on top of, critical resistances work the same way. This is when the modifier is only 60%. Had we started from 125, these numbers would be a lot lower. So critical resistances scale exponentially on themselves, but they are also countered by people building high critical damage modifiers, because then you get lower value from them. And that is very important when we move on to the next topic. So the next topic is about why the meta matters. So I put the meta into two different types of builds. Firstly, crit combo builds with high critical damage modifiers built around a quick succession of critical damage hits, versus damage over time builds that are usually higher penetration builds with higher critical chance, lower the critical damage modifiers, that are more focused on sustained pressure to then eventually make their targets run out of resources and die. So why does this matter? Well, this matters because armor does mathematically better against crit builds, but in practice it can also do worse. Whereas critical resistance does mathematically worse against crit builds. We've just talked about how critical resistances are countered by critical modifiers, but in practice they do better. And this is because when it comes to these quick burst combos, you're usually looking at a quick succession of critical hits. So it's mainly the critical hits that do damage. And usually people will do what is called crit farming, which means that maybe a build only theoretically has 36% crit chance, but in this quick burst succession they might have 75% critical hits. And this means that while the critical resistances are countered mathematically, they have some practical advantages, and the same goes for armor. It's mathematically better because builds that have high critical it compares better because of the high critical damage modifiers, but it compares worse because we're mainly looking at the critical hits. The opposite is then true for builds built around dots, because when it comes to dot pressure builds, usually you can let average hits, so you're counting both the critical hits as well as the non-critical hits. The critical chance modifier matters a lot more because you're not looking at maybe a 2 or 3 second scope. You're looking at multiple seconds, maybe minutes of combat. But armor, as I said earlier, is countered by high penetration builds. Critical resistances, on the other hand, do mathematically well against dot builds because they usually have lower critical damage modifiers because they rank things like maces instead of axes. And they also tend to have high critical chances as well. So this means that when an armor is mathematically strong, it's practically weak. When critical resistance is mathematically strong, it's practically weak. And this video is going to be about how we account for that when we make our choices. So to illustrate this, I've come up with these two scenarios. And the first scenario we're going to look at is a scenario where armor should come out ahead mathematically. So we're talking about a build with relatively low penetration, as we have 23,000 effective armor. We don't have that many critical resistances. This is base resistances plus a couple of impenetrable traits. Then we look at the mitigation from both of them. And we look at a scenario where the enemy has a relatively high critical damage modifier of 90% to start with, plus a relatively low critical chance, And then we also have a crit farmed combo, so this is against the crit scenario where critical chance does not matter, because we're looking at 2 to 3 seconds where we're having a lucky succession of critical hits. And what we see is what we expect at first. So the reinforced trait is of course always going to give the same mitigation. Then we have the average, which is then accounting for the critical chance. Then we have the crit farmed combo, which is 75%, and then only the critical hit. And what we see is that despite the fact that this is a scenario where the reinforced trait should do really well, because we're looking at a high critical damage modifier build, it makes sense to then mostly look at this crit farmed combo for comparison. And what we see is that despite this being a scenario where we expect reinforced to do the best, they are more or less on equal terms. Of course, this is a setup I've made specifically just to illustrate this. This is not an actual build, but when you run the math on actual builds fighting against each other, this is mostly what you will find, is that yes, on average, armor does incredibly better than critical resistances in this specific case, but because we're mostly looking at the critical hits and we don't care too much about the non-critical hits, Impenetrable actually compares more or less on equal terms with armor, in this case, if not a little better. Then we have our second illustration, which is a case of a build with much more penetration. So this is the dot focus build. We see we only have 16,000 effective armor, much more critical resistances typically. So in this case, you would also have Rallying Cry on top. And then what we see is also a much lower critical damage modifier, as well as a higher critical chance. So this is the build focused on countering the dot builds. And what we see here is then that the crit farm scenario, the Impenetrable trait does a lot stronger, as well as if we count only the critical hit. But what we also see is that we have a lot when it comes to comparing the average hit, reinforced does a lot better, so it's more or less on equal terms. And this is the exact same thing we saw before, that when we saw the reinforced trait had its stronger mathematical scenario, it was more or less on equal terms, so we actually accounted for what we cared about. And in this case, because we're focusing on the dot heavy build, the only thing that really matters is the average hit. We also have to account for a lot of non-critical hits, and they fight on more or less equal terms. And what is then the conclusion of this? So the conclusion of this is that it's pretty much a zero-sum game. The mathematical gain against crit stacking builds for armor is equally mitigated by the increased importance of critical hits. Again, we do mathematically a lot better, but we're also just focusing on these critical hits for the burst combo. The same is then true for critical resistances, in that the mathematical gain against penetration stacking builds for critical resistances is equally mitigated by increasing focus on average mitigation over specific critical hits. When it comes to these dot pressure builds, you have to also account all the non-critical hits, because there's a lot of them, and also their critical chances tends to be a lot closer to their actual values than this streak of lucky critical hits in a quick succession. So basically the conclusion is that it's a zero-sum game. There is no scenario where critical hits are critical mitigation is better in terms of the meta, and the same goes for armor. Basically, if someone tells you that we are in a crit damage meta, so you should wear critical resistances, that is not exactly true. And then on the opposite end, if someone tells you that we're not in a crit meta, so armor is better, that is not necessarily true either, because those metas then have mitigation in itself. And that leads us to the conclusion. The conclusion is then there is really nothing to take advantage in from the meta, or whatever builds a build you're facing. What actually really matters is your build, and what you have to take advantage is what we talked about in the beginning of this video. take advantage of the increasing returns already present in your build. So focus on one stat whenever possible. This means that if you have something like Rallying Cry, focus on getting more impenetrable traits because they scale exponentially on top of that Rallying Cry. Same goes for armor. If you have a lot of armor present in your builds through either buffs or passives, or maybe just wearing a lot of heavy armor, same is true. So do not spread out your mitigation. So let's say you have a build with Rallying Cry, don't go and wear a lot of reinforced traits, and the same goes for the opposite. If you have a lot of armor present in your build from other sources, don't go and stack a lot of impenetrable. Of course, if you're not wearing heavy armor, reinforced loses a lot of value. There's also the fact that a reinforced chest gives you a lot more, so that's still worth it. But what I typically see is people making the mistake of wearing then a couple of impenetrable traits, but then they think, oh, I have enough critical resistances now, I'll just put in on some reinforced as well, so I also have some armor. That is not a good idea. Focus on just one stat instead of focusing on both whenever possible, because then that allows you to then get some increased exponential returns and then get more value out of your train. Of course, there are cases where this is not possible. If you look at my PvP healer build, we have Osison on the head, we have then Rallying Cry on the weapons, but that's because we don't really have much choice because those buffs are just that good. But when it comes to choosing these traits, try and choose just one trait and focus on that, because they scale on each other in terms of current damage mitigation, and that is really important. And that is also the conclusion of this video. It does not matter what kind of build you're facing. What matters is your own build. And that was pretty much it for this video, and thank you for watching.